Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 36th deck and it's titled Devilish Discard. And if you haven't seen our show before, what we're doing is we are randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a deck around a theme of the chosen card. So before we jump into the deck tech, I do want to very quickly plug some of our social media accounts. If you are interested in following us over on Twitter, checking us out on Reddit, sending us an email, these would be the best places to go to get a hold of us. If you're ever interested in joining the channel, we'd love to have some new people playing in some games, get some fresh faces in there. And then as always too, if you have any suggestions for future videos, if you have any questions or just cards that you would like to suggest for this series, please send them to me there. You can also put them in the YouTube channel as well, put them in the comments below. And as always, please do like and subscribe to the channel. We appreciate it. It definitely helps us grow. And without any further ado, let's jump into our deck for the week. And this week, our random card is going to be Fiery Temper, which is 1 red for an instant that deals 3 damage to any target. And it has Madness for a red, which means that if we discard this card, we discard it into exile, and when we do, we can cast it for its Madness cost or put it into our graveyard. So, Fiery Temper is basically just a lightning bolt as long as we cast it while we are discarding it. And so that led us down a bit of a madness path, and I decided I didn't want to go the traditional red-black madness style decks or like a vampire style deck. So instead, I actually turned to one of my personal favorite commanders, and that is Zurzoth Chaos Rider. 2 and a red for a legendary creature devil. It's a 2/3. And whenever an opponent draws their first card each turn, if it's not their turn, you create a 1/1 red devil creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. And whenever 1 or more devils you control attacks 1 or more players, you and those players each draw a card and then discard a card at random. So we want to make a ton of devils with Zurzoth and then attack our opponents with those devils, discard some cards, and then be able to hopefully cast some of those cards with Madness or put some cards in our graveyard that want to be there, trigger some discard synergies. That is the general goal of this deck. And so to that end, we do have 3 major themes that show up throughout the course of this. The first, as we've kind of already mentioned, discard. So we have cards like Anji's Ravager, which is 2 and a red for a creature vampire berserker. It's a 3/3. It attacks each combat if able, and whenever Anji's Ravager attacks, discard your hand, then draw 3 cards, and it has Madness for 1 and a red. So Anji's Ravager is perfect for what we're trying to do because it can help us discard cards, but if it is one of those cards that we did discard, we can also cast it for Madness. So we want to be able to not only discard our cards, but get some use out of the cards that we have discarded. So that way, if we were to discard Anji's Ravager, we can still cast it and we still get the value out of it. And then our next major theme for this deck are cards that actually want to be in our graveyard, so they kind of play into our discard synergy. So for that, we have Ox of Agonis, which is 3 red for a creature, Ox, 4/2. When Ox of Agonis enters the battlefield, discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. So very similar to Anji's Ravager, but instead of an attack trigger, it's an enter the battlefield trigger. And it also has Escape for red and exile 8 other cards from your graveyard, so we can cast this card from our graveyard for the escape cost, and it escapes with a +1/+1 counter on it. So once we've discarded Ox of Agonis, we can cast it from our graveyard to hopefully draw into some more cards, maybe force ourselves to discard some cards, and then just kind of value our way out from there. So whether we're discarding it or casting it, it's definitely a card that we want to see in our graveyard. And then finally, our last major theme of the deck is going to be devils. So we have Zariel, Archduke of Avernus, 2 red for a legendary planeswalker Zariel, 4 loyalty. +1, creatures you control get +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. Very useful. But the real reason that this is in here is for its 0 ability that says create a 1/1 red devil creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. Because Zurzoth cares about us attacking with devils in order to discard cards, we need to make sure that we have a critical mass of devils. Typically, devils tend to be little 1/1s that do 1 damage to something when they die, and we do have some other devil cards in there as well, but being able to get a ton on board means we can attack each opponent, triggering Zurzoth for each opponent. We'd still only draw and discard one card, but we would actually make 3 devils on our attack step because we attacked 3 opponents. Meaning as long as we can have 3 devils, we don't care if we just kind of throw them into our opponent's boards because we'll immediately replace them. And then, of course, can't forget, just in case we ever get there, Zariel does have an ultimate, -6. You get an emblem with, at the end of the first combat phase on your turn, untap target creature you control. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. So very useful if we could ever get there, but honestly, I don't anticipate it. I would imagine we use her 0 much more than we use her +1, but it's not impossible, and it is a good end to the game if we need it. Getting double combat can definitely close out a game super quick. But those are our themes for the deck. So let's take a quick look at some key cards, some of the very important cards to what we're actually trying to accomplish here. The first of which is Glinthorn Buccaneer, 1 red for a Minotaur Pirate with haste. It's a 2/4. And whenever you discard a card, Glinthorn Buccaneer deals 1 damage to each opponent, and we can pay 2, discard a card, draw a card, but we can activate that ability only if Glinthorn Buccaneer is attacking. So Glinthorn Buccaneer is an all-star in this deck. Being able to hurt our opponents for every single card we discard is phenomenal. That's exactly what we want to be doing because we are hoping to just kind of churn through a ton of cards, discard, a whole hand at a time. So we're talking 5, 6, 7 cards. So we could, in theory, if we discard our entire hand, do 7+ damage to the entire table in one go with Glinthorn Buccaneer. And then our next key card is Surly Badgersaur. It's 3 and a red for a Badger Dinosaur. It's a 3/3. Whenever you discard a creature card, you put a +1/+1 counter on Surly Badgersaur. Whenever you discard a land card, create a treasure token. And whenever you discard a non-creature, non-land card, Surly Badgersaur fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. So again, this card really does everything we want to be doing in this deck. Remember though, Zurzoth says that we discard our cards at random, so we might not know what cards we're discarding, and that's okay. Surly Badgersaur gives us something for every single card we discard. It either gets bigger, makes us some treasure tokens for mana, or it can be removal if we need it, especially once it's got a ton of counters on it anyway. So Surly Badgersaur also definitely an all-star in this deck. And then finally, our last key card is Fervent Mastery, 3 red for a sorcery. You may pay 2 red rather than pay this spell's mana cost. And then if the 2 red mana cost was paid, an opponent discards any number of cards, then draws that many cards. Honestly, we're going to try to never do that one. We really want to cast this for 5, not 4. And I don't foresee any situations where we would want to do the 4, but I suppose it's not impossible. But whether we pay the 4 or the 5, we still get the effect, which is we search our library for up to 3 cards, put them into our hand, shuffle, then discard 3 cards at random. Normally, this would be a huge downside, not knowing which cards we're going to discard, but in this deck, we really don't care what cards we're discarding. Most of our cards want to wind up in the graveyard anyway. So this could allow us to search our deck for 3 cards, and whether we throw them into the graveyard or keep them in our hand, we're usually pretty happy either way. So this allows us to get cards maybe with flashback or escape or madness, and so that way we're never super unhappy if those cards that we searched up are the ones that get thrown away. But those are our key cards. So the last bit of the deck tech that I would like to do is some cool interactions. Try to look at some cards that work very well together, that synergize well. And the first pair of cards that I would like to talk about is Bralin Sky Shark Rider and Ruin Grinder. So Bralin Sky Shark Rider, 3 and a red for a legendary creature human shaman. He's a 3/3. Partners with Shabraz the Sky Shark, which we can't play Shabraz, we're not in the right colors. But Bralin's pretty good on his own. And because he says whenever you discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Bralin Sky Shark Rider, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. And you can pay red, target shark gains trample until end of turn. We don't have any sharks in here, so that's not super relevant. But being able to make Bralin bigger and do 1 damage to each opponent whenever we discard a card is phenomenal. This allows us to have a giant creature that can start swinging and do damage even if we're not able to get through our opponent's board. So if we pair that up with Ruin Grinder, which is 5 and a red for an artifact creature construct, it's a 7/4 with Menace. When Ruin Grinder dies, each player may discard their hand and draw 7 cards, and it also has Mountain Cycling 2, so we could discard it for 2 mana, search for a mountain, and put it into our hand. That's nice, but really we want it for the death trigger. We want it to be able to die so that each player could discard their hand and draw 7 cards. So, like I mentioned earlier with Glinthorn Buccaneer, with Brawlin on the board, if we somehow can get Ruin Grinder to die, we're able to discard our hand, however many cards that is, maybe play some off of Madness, maybe put some flashback spells in our graveyard. Then we draw 7 cards, putting 7 +1/+1 counters on Brawlin, and being able to do 7 damage to our opponents. So not only did we get value from discarding our cards, now we have a 10/10 creature on board, and we just did 7 to each opponent. So that alone can be a massive threat. And on the bright side too, Ruin Grinder does have Menace and is a 7/4. So if our opponents really don't want it to die, we can just keep chipping in for 7 every single turn until eventually they have to do something about it. So these two can be a very quick way to end the game if they're used properly together. And then our next cool interaction is between Burn Down the House and Subira Tulzidi Caravaneer. Burn Down the House, 3 red for a sorcery. Choose one. Burn Down the House deals 5 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, so it's a board wipe if we need it. Or we create 3 1/1 red devil creature tokens with, when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. They gain haste until end of turn. So we can just immediately make 3 1/1s and then throw them at our opponents, hopefully triggering Zurzoth, make some more devils, discard some cards. But if we can combine that with Subira, who is 2 and a red for a legendary creature human shaman, 2/3 with haste, you can pay 1 mana and another target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn, so we could make sure our devils get through if we need them to. And the big ability here is pay 1 and a red, tap, discard your hand. Phenomenal. We love to discard things. Until end of turn, whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So even if we just have Burn Down the House, we cast it, we make 3 devils, we get in, we activate Subira, and then hopefully, if we have no cards in hand, then we just draw 3 cards. If we have any cards in hand, we discard them, maybe cast some more spells into Madness, maybe we get some flashback cards in the graveyard, whatever. And then we still draw the 3 cards. So Subira is a phenomenal card when we're trying to go wide with all of our devil tokens, and it's also a discard outlet, it draws us cards. Subira is a phenomenal card for this deck, and it's even better when we can get 3 hasty devils with Burn Down the House. But that is our deck for the week. The final piece to this is checking out the price of it, and this week the price is actually pretty low. We wound up coming in at $57.56, which is a lot lower than our budget. It's almost half of our total budget, and most of that price actually comes from one particular card, which is Seize the Day. It's 3 and a red for a sorcery, untap target creature. After this main phase, there is an additional combat phase, followed by an additional main phase, and it has flashback for 2 and a red. This card alone is $7.40. If you cut this card out of the deck, you're looking at about a $50 deck, which is, like I said, about half of our budget. Phenomenal for what we're trying to do here. And I can't complain at all about Seize the Day being in here. It's a phenomenal card. Being able to attack multiple times with Zurzoth, being able to attack multiple times with Subira or some other creatures that we have in here, Ruin Grinder especially. So Seize the Day is an all-star in here, but like I said, it is $7.40, so if you do need to cut it, get the price down closer to $50, this is definitely a card to cut. But overall, I'm very happy with how this deck turned out. It's pretty budget, and I got to use Zurzoth, which, like I said earlier, is one of my personal favorite commanders. So being happy with the deck as it's built is one thing, but I do think we need to jump into a game and test it out. So we are actually going to jump into a game and see how this deck performs against some opponents. So today, we are going to be testing this deck out against Alesha, who smiles at death, Jarina Kudrow, and Tanazir Quandrix. So Alesha is Mike's deck for the week. This is a bit of a reanimator style deck. He wants to throw some cards in the graveyard, reanimate them, and hopefully get some bigger threats earlier than he should be able to. We have Jarina Kudrow, which is Lena's deck for the week. This is a human tribal deck. It's mostly the pre-con deck, but it has been upgraded slightly, so that way she's got some extra oomph to it. And then Tanazir Quandrix is Shawn's deck of the week, the Elder Dragon that wants to be putting +1/+1 counters on creatures. So I expect him to make some very large creatures very quickly, and I'm hoping we can kind of chump block some of what he's doing with some devils. But these are our opponents for the week. I think the game's going to be pretty fun. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you guys enjoy it as well, and I will talk to you guys after the game. At the start of the game, Mike goes first, followed by myself, Lena, and then Shawn. On Mike's first turn, he plays a swamp. On my turn, I play a mountain. Lena plays a battlefield forge. Shawn plays a forest. Mike plays a swamp and then casts Soul Ring, and immediately follows that up by casting Key to the City, which he can tap and discard a card to make a creature unblockable, and also pay 2 mana when it untaps to draw a card. On my turn, I play a mountain, and then, not to be outdone by Mike, I cast my own Key to the City. On Lena's turn, she plays a mountain. Shawn plays an island, and then at the end of turn, Mike activates his Key to the City, discarding a Corpse Knight. On Mike's turn, when the Key to the City untaps, he pays 2 to draw a card, and then he plays a Plains and passes. On my turn, I play a mountain and cast my commander, Zurzoth Chaos Rider. Lena plays a command tower and casts Thraben Doomsayer, which can tap to create a 1/1 human token. Shawn plays a forest and casts Replicating Ring. Then, at the end of turn, Mike once again activates his Key to the City, this time discarding a swamp. And then, just like last time, when Mike untaps, he pays 2 for the Key to the City to draw a card. He then plays a mountain and casts his commander, Alesha Who Smiles at Death. On my turn, I attack Shawn for 2 with Zurzoth, and on the attacks, we both draw a card and then discard a card at random. This also allows me to make a 1/1 Devil token, since Shawn drew a card when it wasn't his turn, and when I discard, I wound up discarding a Skophos Reaver, which I cast for its madness cost. Then in my second main phase, I play a mountain and cast Goblin Bombardment, which can sacrifice a creature to do 1 damage to any target. Lena plays a Scoured Barrens, gaining a life, and then casts a Humble Defector, which can tap to draw 2 cards and then be given to an opponent, and she then taps the Thraben Doomsayer, making a 1/1 human token. On Shawn's turn, he plays a forest and casts Fractal Summoning to create a 0/0 fractal token with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Then at the end of turn, Mike activates the Key to the City, discarding Fetid Heath. When Key to the City untaps, Mike pays 2 to draw a card, and then he casts a Faithless Looting, drawing 2 more cards and discarding 2 cards. This has him discarding Yahenni, Undying Partisan, and a swamp. Mike then plays a Plains and attacks Shawn for 3, and on the attacks, he activates Alesha to return Yahenni tapped and attacking to the field. Still before blocks though, Mike activates his Key to the City, discarding a Chrome Mox to make Yahenni unblockable. Shawn then takes 5 total damage. On my turn, I play a Field of Ruin, and then I move to combat, but before attacks are declared, Mike casts Path to Exile, exiling Zurzoth and letting me put a basic land into play tapped. I then decide to attack Mike for 4 with the Skophos Reaver. In my second main phase, I cast Sin Prodder, which lets me reveal the top card of my deck in my upkeep, and an opponent may pay life equal to its casting cost to have me put it into the graveyard. Otherwise, I draw it. I also cast Hobblefiend, which can sacrifice creatures to put +1/+1 counters on itself. Lena plays a mountain, and then casts her commander, Jarina Kudro, making a human token, and giving all of her humans +2/+0. She then activates Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and giving control of it to Shawn, and then at the end of turn, she activates Doomsayer to make another human token. On Shawn's turn, he immediately activates Humble Defector to draw 2 cards and return it to Lena's control. He then plays Thornwood Falls, gaining a life, and casts Hadana's Climb, which puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature when he goes to combat, which Shawn immediately does, putting the counter on his fractal and transforming the climb into Winged Temple of Arazka, which can double a creature's power and give it flying. He then attacks Mike for 4. In his second main phase, he cast Reclamation Sage to destroy Mike's key to the city. On Mike's turn, he plays Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, making every land a swamp in addition to its other types, and then moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 3 with Alesha, activating her on attacks to return Corpse Knight to play, attacking me. I block the Knight with my Devil token, but before damage, I sacrifice the Devil to Goblin Bombardment, putting a counter on Yahenni and doing 2 total damage to Alesha, killing Mike's commander, and he decides to let her go to the graveyard. Second main phase, he casts a Karmic Guide to return Alesha to play and do 2 damage to each opponent with Corpse Knight. In my upkeep, Sin Prodder triggers, revealing Bedlam Reveler, and since nobody wants to take 8 damage, I put it into my hand and then draw for turn. I then cast Soul Ring and recast Zurzoth before attacking Shawn for 3 with Sin Prodder. On attacks, we both draw a card and then discard a card at random, and since he drew a card on my turn, I make a 1/1 Devil token. Unfortunately for me though, I wind up discarding the Bedlam Reveler that I just drew. On Lena's turn, she plays a Plains and casts Zathrid Necromancer, so whenever any of her humans dies, she makes a 2/2 zombie token. And then she casts Heirloom Blade before activating the Thraben Doomsayer to make another human token. She also activates Humble Defector to draw 2 cards and gives it back to Shawn. Shawn once again activates the Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and returning it to Lena, and he then plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to put an island into play tapped. Then he casts Zagana Utopian Speaker, giving his creatures with +1/+1 counters trample and drawing a card. In Mike's upkeep, he sacrifices Karmic Guide to Yahenni, since he wasn't planning to pay the Echo cost anyway, making the Aetherborn indestructible. And then he flashes back Faithless Looting, drawing 2 and discarding 2. This has him discarding a Sacred Foundry and a Godless Shrine. Once Mike moves to combat, but before he declares attacks, I sacrifice a Devil token to Goblin Bombardment, doing 2 damage to Alesha. This kills Mike's commander again, but he does put a counter on Yahenni. In my upkeep, Sin Prodder triggers, revealing a mountain, and Mike selflessly takes 0 damage to have me put it into my graveyard. I then cast Neheb Dreadhorde Champion, which lets me discard any number of cards, draw that many cards, and make that much red mana whenever he deals combat damage. Moving to combat, I attack Mike for 3 with Sin Prodder, and Lena for 2 with Hobblefiend. This triggers Zurzoth, drawing each of us a card and discarding a card at random, and I also make 2 Devil tokens. In response, Mike flashes an Aven Mind Sensor, and then he winds up discarding a Lion's Eye Diamond, and I discard Hellrider. Lena then blocks with a human token, killing both creatures and making her a 2/2 zombie token. Mike blocks with Corpse Knight and Yahenni, killing the Knight and Sin Prodder. Then in the end, Yahenni gets 3 more counters. In my second main phase, I cast Wildfire Devils, which chooses a player at random, and then that player chooses an instant or sorcery in their graveyard that I get to cast for free. In response, Shawn casts Quandrix's Command to have Mike shuffle his Path to Exile, Corpse Knight, and Karmic Guide into his library from the graveyard, and he also puts 2 +1/+1 counters on Reclamation Sage. Then the Wildfire Devil's ability resolves, targeting Mike, but thanks to Quandrix's Command, there are no legal targets in Mike's graveyard, so nothing happens. On Lena's turn, she casts Icon of Ancestry, naming Human, so all her humans get +1/+1, and then activates Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and giving it back to Shawn. She then plays an Exotic Orchard, and casts Frontier Warmonger, which gives any creature attacking Lena's opponent's menace until end of turn. She also activates the Doomsayer, making yet another human token, and then moves to combat, attacking me for 12 damage with 3 human tokens. I block one of the humans with 2 devils, and use the damage they deal when they die to kill another human, but I still take 8 damage. Because 2 of her creatures died, Lena makes 2 zombie tokens, and Yahenni gets 4 more counters. On Shawn's turn, he activates Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and returning it to Lena, and then plays a Forest before casting Beast Whisperer, which draws a card when he casts a creature, which he immediately does when he casts Trigon Predator, which also destroys an artifact or enchantment when it deals combat damage. At this point, Lena also decides to show off the channel's mascot, Spyro the Bearded Dragon. On Mike's turn, he casts Judith the Scourge Diva, which gives his team +1/+0 and does 1 damage to any target when one of his creatures dies. At the end of turn, I activate Key to the City, discarding a Fire Diamond. On my turn, when Key to the City untaps, I pay 2 to draw a card. Then in my upkeep, Wildfire Devils triggers, randomly picking Shawn, who chooses to let me cast the Quandrix's Command in his graveyard as long as I use it to bounce the Frontier Warmonger. I agree, returning the Warmonger to Lena's hand and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Neheb. I then cycle a Smoldering Crater and activate Key to the City, making Neheb unblockable and discarding Reckless Worm, which I cast for its madness cost. I then attack Lena for 7, and when Neheb deals damage, I discard Calibrated Blast and Seize the Day, drawing 2 cards and making 2 red mana. Then in my second main phase, I flashback Seize the Day, trying to untap Neheb and take an extra combat step, but unfortunately for me, Shawn has a response, countering it with a negate. On Lena's turn, she plays a Rakdos Carnarium, returning a mountain to hand, and then casts Kelsine the Plague, before recasting her Frontier Warmonger. She also activates Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards, and gives it back to Shawn. On Shawn's turn, he adapts Zagana, putting 4 +1/+1 counters on her, while Lena taps her Doomsayer to make another human token. Shawn then casts an Evolution Sage, which allows him to proliferate whenever he plays a land, and draws a card, and he then plays an island, proliferating. Mike casts a Smuggler's Copter, which has a crew cost of 1 and also draws a card and discards a card when it attacks, and then he passes. On my turn, when Key to the City untaps, I pay 2 to draw a card. Then in my upkeep, Wildfire Devils triggers, randomly picking Lena, who doesn't have any instants or sorceries in her graveyard, so I get nothing. Then in my first main phase, I cast Zariel, Archduke of Avernus, and activate her 0 ability to put a 1/1 Devil token into play. After that, I cast a Glinthorn Buccaneer, which deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever I discard a card, and I activate Key to the City, making Wildfire Devils unblockable, and discarding Commander Sphere, doing 1 to each opponent. Moving to combat, I attack Shawn for 4 with the Devils, having us both draw a card and discard a card at random, and I also make another Devil token, and this has me discarding Burn Down the House that I just drew, and does 1 damage to each opponent. Lena casts a Cavalry Pegasus, which gives all of her humans flying when it attacks, and then casts a Terminate, destroying Shawn's Zagana. She follows that up by casting a Frontline Medic, which gives her creatures indestructible when it attacks, as long as it attacks with 2 other creatures. Finally, she activates the Doomsayer, making another human token. On Shawn's turn, he activates Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and returning it to Lena. He then casts Incubation Druid, drawing a card, and then casts Invigorating Surge, putting a +1/+1 counter on Incubation Druid, and then doubling the counters to 2. After that, he plays a Breeding Pool untapped, paying 2 life and proliferating. He then casts Incongruity, exiling Aven Mind Sensor and making Mike a 3/3 ape token, but Mike uses it to crew the copter and then sacrifices it to Yeheni instead, doing 1 damage to Zariel. Then Shawn casts a Kodama's Reach, putting a land to hand and another into play, proliferating again. On Mike's turn, he crews Smuggler's Copter with Judith, and then attacks Lena for 4 in the air, drawing a card and discarding a Pyroblast on the attacks. In Mike's second main phase, he casts Tybalt Cosmic Imposter, and then activates Tybalt's -3 ability to exile Lena's Frontier Warmonger. On my turn, when Key to the City untaps, I pay 2 to draw a card, and then in my upkeep, Wildfire Devils triggers, randomly picking Mike, letting me cast the Pyroblast he just put in his graveyard, which I use to destroy Shawn's Trigon Predator, in the hopes that convinces Lena to attack him with her flyers. I then cast a Fervent Mastery, searching my library for 3 cards, putting them to hand, and then discarding 3 cards at random. This winds up with me discarding Insatiable Gorgers, Ox of Agonis, and Past in Flames, doing 3 damage to each opponent. I then activate Zariel's 0 ability, making another Devil token, and then I attack Lena and Mike for 1 each with a Devil, meaning we all draw a card and then discard a card at random, and I make 2 more Devil tokens. This has Mike discarding a Stitcher's Supplier, and I wind up discarding a Charmbreaker Devils, doing 1 more damage to each opponent. In my second main phase, I cast Anji's Ravager, which discards my hand and draws me 3 cards whenever it attacks. On Lena's turn, she activates Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards and giving it back to Shawn, and she then plays a Swamp, before casting Impact Tremors, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters under her control. She follows that up by casting Trin, Champion of the Free, doing 1 to each opponent, and searching her deck for Trin's partner, Sylvar, Devourer of the Free. She then activates Thraben Doomsayer, making yet another human token, and attacks me for 4 with 1 human token. I block with a Devil, killing both creatures, making Lena a zombie, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Yeheni, and doing 2 damage to each of Lena's opponents. Then at the end of turn, Lena makes another human with Trin, doing 1 more damage to each opponent. On Shawn's turn, Replicating Ring gets its 8th counter, creating 8 copies of itself, and he casts Lore Scale Coatl, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever he draws a card, which he immediately does by activating Humble Defector, drawing 2 cards, and returning it to Lena. Then he casts Urban Evolution, drawing 3 cards, being able to play an additional land this turn, putting 3 more counters on the Coatl. This lets him play 2 forests, proliferating twice, and he follows that up by casting a Force of Vigor, attempting to destroy Impact Tremors and Goblin Bombardment. In response, I use my bombardment to sacrifice 3 devil tokens to do 6 total damage to Shawn. Then the Force of Vigor resolves, destroying both of the enchantments. Shawn then casts a Herald of Secret Streams, drawing a card, putting a counter on the Coatl, and making his creatures with counters on them unblockable. He casts an Exponential Growth, doubling the Fractal's power and toughness twice, making it a 36 power creature, which he uses to immediately attack Lena for 36 unblockable damage, knocking her out of the game, and also attacks Mike for 14 damage that is also unblockable. On Mike's turn, he activates Tybalt's +2 ability, exiling the top card of each player's deck, hitting a Forest, a Mountain, which Mike plays for turn, and an Anger, which Mike casts. He then uses Anger to crew the Smuggler's Copter and attacks Zariel for 4, drawing a card and discarding a Mana Crypt, but killing my Planeswalker. In my upkeep, Wildfire Devils triggers, randomly picking myself and letting me cast a Fervent Mastery for free from my graveyard. This lets me search my library for 3 cards, put them to hand, and then discard 3 cards at random, discarding all of them since I have no cards in hand. This means I wind up discarding a Faithless Looting, a Fiery Temper, and an Avacyn's Judgment, doing 3 to each opponent. Then when I discard Avacyn's Judgment, I pay 7 into the X, doing 4 damage to Mike and 3 to Shawn, knocking them both out and winning me the game. Alright, so that game was a ton of fun. It was definitely a long game. Overall, it was about 2 hours and 20 minutes long, so definitely on the longer side of things. But all the decks at the table definitely showed their power. Mike, unfortunately, with Alesha, got a little bit stuck on mana, only had 1 red source throughout most of the game, but even with that, he had a massive Yahenni that was putting up quite the threat on the board. Lena's Jarina deck put up a ton of creatures and became the threat very early on, and I think that was the big reason why Shawn killed her when he had the chance, which also kind of terrifying considering his board of unblockable creatures. But in the end, for us, luckily, our Devils and discard strategies were able to get there. I think the ability to just kind of ping our opponents down with Glinthorn Buccaneer and our Devils and Goblin Bombardment really paid off in the end, but this deck was a ton of fun to play. Like I've mentioned multiple times throughout this video, I do have my own personal Zurzoth deck. It's not quite as focused on the madness, but after playing this deck, I may have to switch mine up a little bit because it was tons of fun. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please do let me know. But otherwise, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.